Hey, what's up? I want to talk about some lesser mentioned, perhaps not talked about enough wide receivers in this year's draft class. It's not going to be an in-depth video, I'm not going to dig into stats, I just want to put some names in front of your face, because maybe you should pay attention to the noise that happens with them around the combine and the draft, and knowing earlier does give you a little bit of an edge, especially if your rookie draft doesn't happen as soon as it should. So, yeah. Alright, so these are my top 5 wide receiver prospects I recently ran over in another video. They're all great, you should draft them all, I think they're wonderful. Now, some of the wide receivers I think are getting lesser mentioned are Rashee Rice, who currently has second round draft capital expectation if you look at mock draftable and stuff, and I think that's somewhat underrated. I talked about him and wrote actually an article about him for DLF, which I also posted the information of for my Patreons, because they're my Patreons, and I think he's a really interesting prospect you should definitely take a closer look at. He's standing out to people who watch more than people that grind numbers, but honestly his numbers don't look particularly bad. He's playing at 11 ADOT and 70% slot rate. There's relatively few great producers with that particular role, and that's probably why he has high expectation in the draft this year than I would ultimately expect for an older player with his best season in terms of production being at age 21. Those are usually can be sort of hum-ha orange flags, if not red flags, but there's a lack of players who excelled in that particular role or are exceptionally productive in that particular role in this draft class that don't have infinitely worse red flags than just being a slightly older prospect. So Rashee Rice is really interesting, and I expect him to get higher draft capital than a lot of people are currently probably expecting. The next guy is Zay Flowers, because I'm trying to get better at listening. I don't like Zay Flowers' profile, to be clear. I don't think he had enough yards. I don't think he did enough in receiving yards per team pass attempt. I don't think he did enough in yards per route run, as much as I care about that number, which is almost not at all. But I'm trying to get better at listening, and something Travis May said on my podcast, and I've heard other people say as well, is that Zay Flowers has a dynamic skill set that NFL teams are going to like. Actually, they say things like playmaker and explosive, and I don't know what those things mean, but he does have a lot of touchdowns. Also, an interesting feature of his profile, he's actually used in the rushing game a little bit, which adds a dimension to his wide receiver profile, which is becoming part of profiling that we should probably pay more attention to. If you go look at his overall numbers, again, they're not particularly impressive, especially for a guy running a 14, a 15, and then a 10. It does drop in that final year, ADOT, but a slot rate that's just in the tank. Oh, sorry, he played 4 years. That's another thing that data nerds and age profilers aren't going to like. But it's about age-adjusted profiling, not about age profiling, because age profiling is just bad and wrong, and they shouldn't do it. But he played no less than 12 games, so we don't really have a sample size problem. And again, his yards per route numbers kind of suck. It's like worse than Keyshawn Johnson's question marks, who are actually good numbers at that relatively high ADOT and relatively low slot usage, but they're a little worse. And you can see that he's marginally, he's the wide receiver 1 of a college team. That's what his receiving yards per team pass attempt show me, especially when you take into context of his ADOT and the fact that his slot rate never exceeds 48%, and he's definitely working on a lower slot usage. But just because I have these columns in here for looking at running backs when I'm doing some profiling, I just happen to notice he is consistently used a couple times, at least, significantly enough, especially for a wide receiver, as a rusher. I want to dig into that a little bit more. I want to go back to Travis May, and if he's still answering questions, because he's probably back to his job doing the whole stock market thing for Mojo on college prospects right now. But whether these were design runs, whether this was working as a running back, whether this was Deebo Samuel-like, or whether they were just jet sweeps, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it definitely adds a dynamic part of his profile that, and again, it's increasingly becoming a part of what the NFL uses some wide receivers for, and that combined with the fact that he was, 54% of his team's receiving touchdowns that final year. That's usually a red flag with marginal to decent receiving yards as well. But again, I just think we should investigate him a little further, not write him off for generic identifiers like breakout age and age he is when he enters the draft. Ultimately, I don't think his profile looks near as good as those top 5. I'm not interested in him there. But there's more to this profile than people may notice off the top, so it's worth looking at. The next guy is not Jaylen Hyatt. He's actually going to score relatively well in models. I think he does in mine, and I think he's a false flag. I think he's just not that great. I think he's okay. Again, there's a lack of players with that high slot, high A dot profile, but it's kind of a very common bust range, and looking as over, I think he's just a very limited role player who scores high because he got high numbers as a wide receiver in college. I don't like him. Marvin Mims is actually another player that I want to mention to you, though. He is standing out to some of the tape grinders like Zach Reed from the Dynasty Dummies. I haven't dug into enough as well, but Marvin Mims should definitely be getting mentioned, and if you haven't heard about him before, I would definitely recommend checking him out. He's in a separate tier from Jaylen Hyatt and Save Flowers for me, and Rashee Rice, but I'm still digging into him, and I'm really thinking about elevating him into that third tier, depending on what happens in the draft and the combine and what I find when I investigate. Again, Flowers and Mims are players who score below average when I look at their numbers relative to their cohort in terms of ADOT and slot usage. When I look at yards per route run and receiving yards per team pass attempt, but there is almost more depth to a prospect profile, and since they're standing out in some other ways, you should probably check them out. Cedric Tillman is someone you can ignore. Trey Palmer is somewhat interesting, especially in terms of his usage. And a lack of players in that category. Again, a 67% slot rate in his best year in a 13 ADOT. He is coming at a slightly older age, but we should probably expect that with this draft class in particular because of the context that's been driving college production lately because of new transfer potential and also because of COVID and delayed eligibility for some players. Trey Palmer's coming from a lower conference player. He's not incredibly enticing, but I do think he's a player you should look into in more depth, and I started to, and actually recently wrote him up for Patreon as well. Jaylen Reed is another player currently projected to be drafted in the 4th round of rookie drafts. I don't think you should be drafting wide receivers that deep in rookie drafts in general. They're mostly busts, but draft capital is no longer a reason to draft a wide receiver by the time we get to the 4th round of rookie drafts. In fact, that's the one way you can almost assure yourself that you're going to get a miss, because if you look at the history of ADP, all wide receivers miss there, so any wide receiver that you draft in the 4th round because of draft capital has missed. The 2 exceptions are Jacoby Myers and who's the other guy? Kyle Phillips recently. Actually, they were both drafted in the 4th round of their rookie drafts. Now, because it took Jacoby Myers a while to do anything with the Patriots, he might have ended up on the waiver wire before he became Jacoby Myers over the last 2 years for fantasy. So that's worth knowing. Another reason to avoid wide receivers in the 4th round of rookie drafts. But both of them were undrafted, and even Kyle Phillips managed to increase his value through the first few weeks of the season with the New York Giants, and he was an older prospect. I was looking back at what I wrote about him pre-draft, and it just says, literally this is a note, I am ashamed of myself. I don't know, man, he's old, I'll check him out later. And I never went back to check him out again. But yeah, undrafted free agent in the 4th round, if we look into him a little bit deeper now, we don't have to do that work later if they get somewhat more interesting or have an interesting landing spot. And the fact that Jaylen Reed is probably an undrafted free agent prospect, and Trey Palmer more likely to be undrafted than taken on day 3, put it that way, I think they're players we should get familiar with right now, because they're more productive than most relative to how they were being used in college, and some of the red flags we know we can squint at a little bit. Draft capital doesn't matter when you're likely to be drafted that low in the NFL and in rookie drafts, and some of the production metrics are standing out enough. Not enough for me to gush about their overall stats or quote yards per out run and receiving yards per team pass attempt, but they're standing up on a weighted age-adjusted receiving yards per team pass attempt metric that I've been looking at, which is not worth putting in the database yet. But it's something I've been playing around with, and they both stood out to me, so I'd be interested to see what you guys think or what anyone else thinks. So let me know if you've looked at them already. Let me know if you haven't. And thanks for checking out another video. I'll talk to you again in the next one.